Good afternoon and welcome to this Euractiv online event, which is kindly supported by the Environmental Defence Fund Europe. My name is Frédéric Simon, I'm the Energy and Environment Editor of Euractiv, and I will be your host for today's event, which is titled EU Methane Regulation, How Can Policymakers Raise Ambition? Now, today's event comes in the context of a surge in global gas prices across the world, and a simultaneous push by the European Commission to regulate emissions of climate warming methane in the atmosphere. So where do we stand when it comes to regulating methane emissions in Europe? How does that fit with action being taken at the international level? And what more can be done to raise the level of ambition? To discuss this topic today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Malcolm McDowell, Team Leader on Methane Emissions at the European Commission's Energy Directorate, Martin Hojsik, a Slovak MEP from the centrist Renew Europe group in the European Parliament, Jutta Paulus, a German MEP sitting with the Greens in the European Parliament. She'll be joining a bit later on. Didier Hulot, President of Eurogas and Executive Vice President at ENGIE, the French energy utility, and Dagmar Drogsma from the Environmental Defence Fund Europe. Welcome to all of you and thanks for joining us today. We'll start this virtual conference with a series of short opening statements from the speakers, and then we'll move on to a Q&A discussion that will also include questions from the audience. To ask a question, simply use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen and we will take questions directly from there. I think that's all for me, so without further ado, let me give the floor to Malcolm McDowell from the European Commission.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. You can go ahead.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting the Commission to this event. A little comment, first of all, before I start with my statement, or I guess you could say it's part of it. Somewhat surprised by the title of the statement, how can policymakers raise ambition, given that this conference is happening after we have only just adopted a proposal on methane regulation before Christmas. I have to interpret this as a Commission official, as that the sponsors, at least the sponsors of this conference, consider at least that this proposal is perhaps not ambitious enough. Having said that, the introductory text for this conference also states specifically that up until now, little has been done in Europe on the regulatory front to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas, and that's true. And indeed, if it is true, then one could say that, relatively speaking, by coming forward with what we consider to be a comprehensive set of obligations on companies and EU member states to measure, monitor, and have verified and to further mitigate methane emissions in the oil, gas and coal sectors, including some obligations to on importers into the EU. With this proposal, the Commission is seeking to significantly increase the ambition. On top, and I want to say also on top of that, you won't be surprised to hear that we think as the Commission that we have delivered an ambitious proposal. And in a few words, what is the justification for thinking that? Well, first of all, this proposal contains obligations for companies to deliver actual source level measurements of methane emissions where possible, as well as site level measurements within a certain amount of time. Whereas currently reporting of energy sector methane emissions is mostly based on non-source specific generic estimations. These estimations are then the basis for the greenhouse gas national inventories reporting that is done on methane emissions to the UNFCCC as part of our commitments to the Paris Agreement. So our proposal, no less, promises to improve on the quality of energy sector methane emissions data that is delivered to UNFCCC. Furthermore, the approach for oil and gas is based on what is considered the best-in-class international standard of reference on oil and gas, MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification of methane emissions, which is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is a multi-stakeholder standard that has been developed together by governments, representatives of society, as well as companies. This proposal furthermore contains an obligation to establish and make publicly available an inventory of all inactive wells and closed or abandoned mines, as well as monitor and measure methane emissions from those wells. Taking into account all these requirements, I think it wouldn't be unfair to say that if the legislators adopted this part of the proposal as such, it would amount, we think, to the most demanding regulation in terms of measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements of oil, gas, and coal methane emissions in the world. This proposal also contains strict obligations on leak detection and repair, would require EU and gas operators to conduct leak detection and repair surveys of all relevant components under their operations every 3 months, and to repair all leaks above a certain threshold immediately after detection or soon thereafter, with an obligation to continuously monitor discovered leaks of all sizes. Furthermore, this proposal contains a prohibition on venting except in the case of an emergency or malfunction, or where unavoidable and when flaring is unfeasible. It also bans routine flaring, adopting the widely supported World Bank definition on that, and only allows any type of flaring to occur if rejection, utilization on site, or dispatch of the methane to market are not feasible options. In addition, it contains the requirement to have complete combustion efficiency in flare stacks to avoid methane slip, an important source of methane emissions in the energy sector. There is also an obligation on member states and/or companies to develop and implement a mitigation plan to remediate, reclaim, and permanently plug inactive wells or coal mines. There again, for the requirements on mitigation as a whole, what we are proposing is, we think, no less than groundbreaking compared to existing methane regulations in the EU or elsewhere. With respect to the EU's energy imports, there is an obligation on importers of fossil energy to the Union to provide member states with information on the methane emissions of their suppliers, as well as the type of measures in place in those countries related to measurement, reporting, and mitigation of methane emissions. We then propose to use this information, all the information we will gather through these other obligations in this proposal, to establish 2 transparency tools that will show the performance and reduction efforts of countries and/or energy companies from across the globe. A transparency database where the data reported by importers and EU operators will be made available to the public, showing the level of commitment of energy companies and energy producing countries across the globe to reduce their methane emissions, as well as the methane emissions that have been provided for all these different sources. And the second tool which we'll be putting in place, the Commission will put in place a global monitoring tool to bring the spotlight on high methane emitting sources inside and outside the EU, which would be harnessing the EU's world leadership in environmental monitoring via satellites, and also based on the most innovative global satellite technologies. There is also the provision to review the imports-related parts of the Methane Regulation by 2025, or earlier even if sufficient evidence is available, with a view to consider introducing more stringent measures applicable to importers if deemed appropriate, and based on the necessary evidence with respect to measurement, reporting, and verification, as well as mitigation of energy sector methane emissions. And there, I am sure to say that we are putting forward, with regard to imports and transparency tools, what we are putting forward is a world first, which no other country in the world currently does. And as last few comments, I would invite anyone who considers that they disagree with this indeed to come forward with practical, realistic proposals to make on how we could be more ambitious. We are more than open to hear them, and would be hopeful then that such suggestions are taken on board by the co-legislators, because our intention is definitely to come up in the end with an ambitious regulation. But I want to make also one last point as regards the ambition level of this proposal, and it is intended for those who are somehow taking for granted just how ambitious we are being with all parts of it. I think it's important to highlight that potentially some co-legislators will no doubt consider that some or even all parts of it are too ambitious and will seek to water it down. So please, what I would say to anyone who is focusing on any one part as opposed to another, not to take any part of it as granted at the expense of concentrating all energy and lobbying efforts on changing those parts which you consider less ambitious. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm McDowell, for explaining the Commission's approach to methane regulation. So let me turn now to Martin Hosik from the European Parliament's Renew Europe group.
So thank you for the invitation, and I'm really happy that we're discussing this issue today, because honestly, I think methane emissions are, especially in the energy sector, a bit of a skeleton in the closet. They haven't been much talked about, and I welcome the Commission initiative. I think that it will be nice to see a broader legislation. It will be really nice to see a legislation which looks beyond just the energy sector, but it's a step forward, and we have to acknowledge that. Now, I have to say, is it something which could be improved? Yes, I think much more could be done, especially on the side of the imported oil and gas. I think this is where we need to be stronger and we need to be bolder. I'm very happy to see the stronger monitoring. We have to look closer on the provisions on the in-situ monitoring besides the estimates, but definitely there is an improvement in the Commission proposal. The ban on routing, flaring and venting is definitely improvement, just like the MRV. Especially why I'm raising the issue of imported oil and gas is outside of the environmental and climate perspective, and I'm sure Jutta Paulus will be talking about it a lot, and definitely it's not a minor issue, it's a major issue. I want to bring an aspect which is not much talked about, and it's a level playing field for European businesses. Because if we have certain requirements from the producers and transporters in Europe, then they would ultimately not trying to bring the same requirements to the gas and oil that's being imported, is something that would put the European gas producers at a disadvantage. And this is where I think we need to have not just calls for international collaboration, but we need to look, I would even dare to say, to something close as we are thinking about in the CBAM on oil and gas imports. Because at the end of the day, I think the motivation should be that the oil and gas that are imported in Europe are on the same standard, and that means also with the least possible methane emissions. So I'm looking forward to the discussions in the Parliament. I'm really hoping that what we will see coming from the Parliament will be a strong proposal how to improve the legislation, how to make it more ambitious in terms of not just the protection of environment and climate, but also in terms of, as I said, the level playing field for European businesses and European producers, and ultimately have an openness also from the Council, where I have a bit of a concern towards an outcome of a trialogue that would see Europe not just leading the way in gas in terms of the domestic, in the methane in terms of the emissions within Europe, but really making sure that we are doing maximum possible to lower the kind of minimize the emissions we are responsible for as a European Union outside of Europe, because that's where most of the emissions that we are responsible are. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin Hosig, and let me turn now to Jutta Polis.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, and I would like to just elaborate a bit on what Martin has already pointed out. The emissions which we are responsible for mainly occur outside the European Union, as 90% of our oil and gas is imported. And therefore, I am a bit disappointed that after having delivered such a strong initiative report on methane emissions in September, the Commission chose to not take up our initiative, but rather propose something which is much weaker, because what the Parliament had called for is actually a firm, clear legal framework with deadlines when it comes to those imported emissions, as I would like to call them, saying that our suppliers will have to make sure that they adhere to LDAR and a ban of venting and flaring and all this, with a clear deadline. So the Commission could have brought forward a proposal saying there will be a certification procedure, or rather there will even be a ban for those that do not adhere to those guidelines. And I will not elaborate a lot on the other sectors, which Martin has already addressed, because of course the initiative report from the Parliament also called for action on the agricultural and the waste sector. And when it comes to the domestic emissions, there also we see, let's call it room for improvement, because of course it's fine to monitor methane emissions from coal mines and also from abandoned coal mines, but it would have been much better to put in an obligation to actually mitigate those emissions, and that to give the member states the possibility to do so, especially for those abandoned mines where no owner can be found, or where the owner has long deceased and no one is the legal successor. And I mean, I'm of course talking of those mines in Silesia where nothing has happened since 1937 or something like this. And there we need a solution and not a further postponement, just monitoring what is emitted from there. Please remember, according to the newest IPCC report, Chapter 1, we have 82 times the greenhouse gas potential of methane within a time frame of 20 years. We want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% within this decade. So this will not be achieved if we do not urgently tackle methane emissions in all sectors. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn now to Didier Olo from NGE and Eurogas.
Hello, everyone. To be very clear, I'm speaking today on behalf of Eurogas. And let me start with a statement that the gas industry in itself, according to International Energy Agency, is only responsible for 8% of the methane emission worldwide. So we have to take that into account. And these 8% are more or less the same as coal emission and oil emission, and it's far less than agriculture, wetlands, and a number of other sources. So 8% is far too much, and we need to reduce that. And there is no doubt within our industry that we are committed to reduce this amount of methane emission. But we also must keep in mind that the gas industry can contribute to the resolution of the 92 other %. Two examples. Well, methane emission from coal mine, be it inactivity or old ones, could be collected within the gas network and put to use rather than being flared in the atmosphere. The same applies to agriculture. By putting agricultural waste into methanization, into biomethane plant, we can avoid natural emission to the environment and therefore contribute to the reduction of the 92%. Second, we have to be fully aware that methane emissions are no longer a very big issue in Western Europe. according to the data we already collected and to the monitoring already in place, for a typical value chain from well production to consumption in Europe, you will be around methane emission less than 0.2% of the methane transported, which means that we are already at a significant level of performance. It doesn't mean that we cannot improve that. We certainly can, and we must, but we have to be aware that the figures that we see in some places around several % of leaks are not representative of what's happening in Europe. And there is a good reason for that. Contrary to other countries, most of our production is happening offshore, where our employees, our people are living on the platform. So they have a definitive vested interest to make sure that there are no leaks. And also the fact that globally Western Europe is more densely populated than other countries like the US makes that our stakeholders have been far more sensitive to leaks than other population, and therefore we have fought against these leaks far more strongly than others. I see a proof of that in the fact that tools like satellite observation by Kairos, and Kairos is a member of Eurogas, have not shown big leaks in Western Europe since they are observing. We see big leaks in other parts of the world, but not so much in Western Europe. Third point I wanted to make is that the real issue today is how do we push the good practices that we have developed in the European gas industry upstream to the supplying countries. And in that respect, we already have an experience within Eurogas because some of our members, like Total Energy, ENI, and so on, are producing in these third countries. And they have shown and demonstrated that in any countries, they are able to reduce the global methane leaks from end to end in the value chain below 0.2, 0.3%. So it's doable. The question is, how do we make it? Transparency is the first step. Diversification of supply provides a leverage over the suppliers. But we have to make sure that we do not jeopardize security of supply at the same time we are pushing these constraints upwards. And that's a topic where the industry, represented by Eurogas, is very happy to work together with the legislature and policymaker in order to find the right way to push the good practices upwards, upstream, towards the supplying country. And we think one thing important in that respect is to stick to the agreed technical framework, which is OGMP 2.0 framework, so the oil and gas methane partnership. That's by adopting these rules, which are internationally recognized, that we will be more efficient in generalizing the good practices that we have in Western Europe in other parts of the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Didier. Let me turn now to Dagmar Drogsma from the Environmental Defence Fund.
Thank you, Frédéric. And well, I'm very happy to be here and to share my thoughts on the proposals. And I hope those thoughts will inspire co-legislators. Perhaps just as an introductory remark, for us, 2021 was a very important year for methane. So the science showed very clearly that if we cut methane emissions urgently, the Paris targets of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius are still within our reach. And also the Global Methane Pledge, launched by the EU and the US at COP26, provides the world with a vehicle to make that happen. So that's all good. We were really pleased with the leadership role the EU showed last year, and we'd like the EU to keep on playing that role. And for me, the question therefore is, does this draft legislation underscore that role or actually undermine it? So I'd like to make two remarks about that. First, we do think that the proposal moves into a positive direction where it relates to the rules that govern measurement, reporting and verification, leak detection and repair, and ending routine venting and flaring. These rules are absolutely essential. Our scientists have gathered empirical data in many places in the world, and there was one pattern there, that all governments, regulators and companies completely underestimate the volume of methane emissions they emit. So this is an essential part of the legislation. We do see some opportunities there to improve that further. And for example, we think that a more frequent obligation for leak detection and repair is really, really important. And there's already precedent for that. So Colorado, for example, is more ambitious than the EU here. They have just adopted a new monthly inspection program, and we really encourage the EU to do that as well. Second, though, and that is where I'm seriously underwhelmed by the draft legislation. I mean, in a way, I would be repeating what previous speakers have already said. But as we do know that 90% of gas consumed within the EU is produced outside its borders, something has got to be done about that. And perhaps, not everyone in the audience may know this, but most of the methane from these imports is released before the gas enters the EU. The draft legislation leaves those upstream methane emissions completely off the hook. And, that doesn't really show leadership. So yes, importers have got to share some information about measurement, reporting, and what have you, but it's not a requirement or a condition for exporters even to provide that information. So we don't really know what that will achieve, therefore. So that aspect, therefore, we see as a lost opportunity for showing real leadership. A mixed picture, therefore, from our perspective. We've got ideas also as to how that part of the legislation can seriously be improved. So we hope that we can touch upon that in the discussion now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dagmar Drogsma. So let me start now the discussion with a question about verification and reporting of methane emission, which is the centerpiece in a way of the Commission proposal that was presented in December. So just to be sure, do you think those rules are strong enough in your view? Do you see loopholes maybe there that need to be fixed? And probably more importantly, do you believe those requirements, in your view, should also apply to imports of natural gas? And maybe Martin Heusig, you can have the floor first on this one.
Well, in terms of the reporting, I think there is always room for tweaking and improving, for example, on the transparency and proactive publishing, going down to the individual locations. And also I want to point out that what is a bit concerning for me in terms of what we saw over the last year with the kind of documentation released by the Clean Air Task Force, I am bit concerned if we actually have sufficient data and in terms of monitoring emissions already also in Europe. So I'm a bit concerned about potential underreporting. So we need more in situ measurements and kind of potentially real-time data to make sure that we don't actually have more methane emissions than we think that we have. So kind of catch the missing things. And have full compliance and I would say proactive compliance with the Aarhus Convention and access to information, to data on the pollution of environment. And for me, it's a pollutant. Second, indeed, the imports are a crucial thing. It's nice to hear from you guys about how we do a lot in Europe. Yes, but that's again where, a European gas producer, which is trying to do the best, is having a disadvantage on its profitability as opposed to Gazprom, let's say, which having seen the satellite pictures of the leaks in the Yamal field, for example, is something which is very concerning. And ultimately, the situation is not ideal, also in the Perm Basin in the US, nor in the Gulf. And it's really sad how, much methane is leaking. And this is for me really the biggest issue that we need to address. There are lots of kind of details on transparency and having high quality monitoring, but if we ignore the imports, then we leave loophole larger than Brussels.
Thanks, Martin Osik. Christopoulos, maybe your views on that same question about reporting, monitoring and verification. Do you believe there are maybe gaps there that need to be filled, and whether you believe that should be extended as well immediately to imports of natural gas coming from places like Russia or United States?
Well, I think the monitoring, reporting, verification issue is something which could be extended to imports fairly quickly. It's much more difficult when it comes to LDAR and the ban on venting and flaring, where I think we must provide a little bit of more time. We already have the common framework, so to speak, on how to monitor, report, and verify those emissions. So basically, nothing hinders us in applying it as quickly as possible, especially since we have been inactive on this issue for more than 20 years now. I mean, the first methane strategy from the Commission dates back to the 1990s. So it's quite unbelievable how long we have ignored this issue. I think what's also important to note, while of course it is true that the satellite images which are monitoring methane emissions worldwide do not see a lot of large emitters in Europe. This is unfortunately not true for the smaller emitters, because I mean it is not only ETF but also Deutsche Umwelthilfe, which have made their own measurements, finding out that there is a lot more gas leaking than originally thought. And therefore, I think these obligations should be deployed as quickly as possible. And as Martin has already pointed out, leaving the imported emissions off the hook just misses 90% of the emissions. And also, I think that by putting these obligations towards the industry now, that's the only way to actually keep a role for gas. Because if you look at this 20-year time frame for the greenhouse gas potential and you do the math, then you end up with a mere 10% advantage of gas concerning greenhouse gas emissions compared with coal. Because as soon as you're at 3, 4, 5% of leakage, that greenhouse gas advantage of gas is already gone. So therefore, what may happen is that, for example, Eastern European countries, which are heavily relying on coal today, would be saying, well, why should we switch to gas in the first place if it doesn't have an advantage? Let's keep our coal power plants running, and in the meanwhile, we try to ramp up our renewables and switch to batteries at once. This is nothing that the gas industry should try to aim for. So therefore, it should be in the industry's own interest to make sure that those emissions are tackled as soon as possible. And also, I believe that the monitoring issue should be very firmly rooted in the legislation, and also an external process to find out whether this monitoring is really finding everything, not only verifying records, but actually doing measurements on a base of sorry, my English is just leaving me, on certain probing, let's say. So of course not verifying every single measurement with a counter measurement, but just going there from time to time, trying to find out whether this is really being done the way it should be. Thank you.
Yes, I guess what you meant was something like auditing or inspections to make sure that the data reported is actually accurate. Let me turn now to Didiolo with the same question about monitoring, reporting and verification. Do you believe there are gaps maybe that need to be filled in the Commission proposal? Do you believe that should be extended to all natural gas imports as well, with a view to regulating them soon?
Well, first let me react to what was just said about coal versus gas. Saying that any leaks in the gas industry can change the order of merit between gas and coal is just wrong, because you have exactly the same methane emission from the coal industry as you have from the gas industry today. So when you make the comparison, you should take the fact that methane emission of both industry are the same. So it doesn't change the comparison in any way. And these are the figures of the International Energy Agency. Second, in terms of monitoring, reporting, verification, we agree that it is necessary, and we already do a lot. What worries us in the Commission proposal is that some of the measures they propose are just far too inefficient in terms of how many greenhouse gas emissions you will avoid with this measure, when more efficient things could be done elsewhere with more significant impact. Let me just take an example. Polyethylene pipes leaks are very limited and quite rare. Particularly, most of them are linked to neighboring works being done underground, so we know where the dangerous areas are. So monitoring every single meter of polyethylene pipe every 3 months is just a waste of time and money compared to the number and volume of leaks you will avoid. So we would like the Commission to come with a more accurate assessment of how much is expected to be earned in terms of methane leak avoidance, and how much it costs and how much money, time, and so on it will take, compared to other measures which may be more efficient. So that's something which we think is lacking in the current proposal. And I don't know if the comparison with Colorado is relevant, because obviously the number of leak detection depends on the kind of material and the age of your network. We know that in Europe we have some old networks, and this one need to be monitored more frequently than the very recent polyethylene ones. So maybe in Colorado the pipes are quite old and you need to measure them more frequently. What we say is that the frequency of monitoring needs to be fit for purpose and adequate to the current state of the network. Coming back to the issue of how much leaks there are indeed, I will strongly oppose any estimate that there are several percent of leakage in Western European networks. Our members do a lot of measurement. I remember doing measurement on platforms offshore. We do measurement on our networks, and each and every time we find figures which are consistent with the 0.2% that I was quoting in my introductory speech. So I think we really have to take into account the fact that not all the gas industry is the same, and that the situation of the US, which is quite bad in certain parts, should not be taken as an example of what's happening in other parts of the world. Another important point is that it's very operator dependent, more than country dependent. If you take the same country, you will find fields operated by big companies which are very much aware of the issue and which have very high level of performance, very low level of leaks, and you will see other fields operated by companies who have no reputation whatsoever to protect and who are doing a very poor job in terms of leaks. So this is also an important point to take into account. You cannot discuss one country as if it were representative of some practices. You will have good and bad operators in the same country. Now, how do we push upstream the good practices of Western Europe? That's a tricky issue, because it's not the habit of Europe to impose internationally its own regulation on other countries. So once again, we need to find a way to push them without jeopardizing our gas supply, because it's still necessary for the years to come.
Okay, thanks, Didier. And so let me now turn to Dagmar Drogsma for your views on monitoring, reporting and verification, and then we'll turn back to Malcolm McDowell maybe for some reactions to what has been said. Dagmar Drogsma, so on monitoring, reporting and verification, briefly, do you believe there are gaps there that need to be filled? And do you believe that should be extended immediately to imports of natural gas?
Well, I don't think you will surprise to hear me say that I do think that has got to be extended immediately to imports. And I think other speakers already very eloquently have explained why. So I won't dwell on that for too long, but it is absolutely essential. I do think that in the MRV part, there are some aspects indeed that could be slightly improved. And so I think we need to look at that really quite carefully. But for example, on the top of my head, there's provision that asks for monitoring of submitting of level 5 emission data only after 3 years. So for those of you who don't know, that is the gold standard of measurement. But if that only happens after 3 years, after the legislation is into force, we only know after some years where the gold standard is actually met. And I don't really see why we would need to wait so long, particularly because those standards come from the OGMP 2.0. So most companies are already familiar with it. I think also in other technical parts of the legislation, things could be improved. I mean, I refer to ELDA. I hear what the previous speaker said. But what is interesting about the Colorado example is that the monthly inspection is for new wells. Yeah, it's not for old data. It is introduced for new well sites. And interestingly, for the older sites that they have, they've got a system where there's flexibility. And those sites that have got the highest amount of emissions have got to be inspected monthly. But then for sites with less emissions, the frequency is a bit less. So that's quite an interesting approach. But it's not true that it's only done for incredibly old sites. No, it's for the new ones. So supposedly the ones that actually are the cleanest. So that's quite interesting. I think also on LDAR, there's some other things that could be improved. So at the moment, for example, the language could be read as that only certain detection tools can be used. So we think it's really important that the language in the legislation makes clear that the best available technology is always used for detecting leaks. And that obviously is important because the technology is moving on. So why limit it to old techniques? So those are a couple of examples that, we'd like to still see some improvements. Thank you.
Thank you, Dagmar Drogsma. And so let me now turn to Malcolm McDowell for some reactions about the question of monitoring, reporting and verification. It seems among the panelists there is strong demand to see those kinds of rules extended immediately to imports of natural gas. What was the Commission's assessment when you looked at this possibility? I guess this is something that you must have looked into before presenting the regulation last year. What was the conclusion of that assessment? Would that be something that would be sound to do both legally and politically?
Yes. Well, I think first of all we need to reflect a little bit more on what the Commission is proposing to do here with regards to importers, and not dismiss it out of hand as something that is unambitious enough and uninteresting. If we do that in the context of discussions in the second stage of the process, we could end up with less, I think, because what we consider we've delivered with the proposal that we have is the result of what we think is the most feasible to do. Now, it's not as ambitious, perhaps, as the most ambitious of different types of measures, such as we heard from some of the stakeholders that went as far as to ask us to even condition access of gas and oil to Europe on complying with the regulations that we are seeking to impose on EU companies. Can you imagine that in this particular current context? How crazy that sounds. And as I said, we're looking to impose obligations which, like every other obligations in this proposal, are subject to penalties to be imposed by member states for non-compliance, and therefore are real obligations. They're not just, I don't know how Dagmar dismissed it as just an information requirement. It's an obligation on importers to supply us with extensive information which will allow us to develop a profile of each and every, and we're looking to do this really for each and every exporter to the EU of oil, gas and coal, with a complete profile on methane emissions, how they're reported, what regulations are in place, exactly, and with a view eventually not only to know more about the methane emissions that are coming from those places, but with a view also to assess after a few years whether we consider that they're doing enough. And it also, what will be interesting with this information is that it will help us to do an assessment together with the International Methane Observatory, Methane Emissions Observatory, to consider whether these countries, many of which have signed up to the Global Methane Pledge, are doing much about meeting it. We'll be assessing that as part of this obligation, these transparency tools that we're putting in place. As I said, no one else is doing this in the world today, so this is a first. It's going to be a challenge. Let's not belittle it as if it's something that we'll easily put together. I think it'll be a challenge to get all that information. And with the monitoring tools that we have in Europe that allows us to see large leaks, large methane emissions elsewhere, we will be able to come back in our bilaterals, in our discussions with other countries in the context of the Global Methane Pledge with actual evidence when we consider that not enough is being done. Let's not forget this review, which is already coming in 2025, depending exactly on when this regulation comes into effect, could be very, very shortly after it comes into effect. This is quite ambitious for the Commission to follow through with. We didn't decide this lightly. This is something we've signed up to already, which will be very arduous, I think, and very difficult to deliver, but we will deliver it. The other thing is we're not just talking, some people have spoken about the timber regulation or how we're regulating renewable fuels that are coming into Europe as finished fuels, and that we're able to the sustainability requirements of which we're able to assess and for which we send verifiers. This is about assessing the methane emissions along an extremely complex supply chain covering 3 different sectors, from production all the way to transmission and final distribution, and which I don't think it'd be very easy to do by sending verifiers to third countries where we have no jurisdictions. So it's easy to say that it's something that should be done. It's rather less easy to try to deliver a system that works. And certification, as we've seen in some existing regulations, don't always work or not very effectively. And I'm surprised that the Greens are so intent on pushing for certification in this field when they've been so critical of the kind of certification that we've put in place for renewable fuels. We should be careful what we wish for. Certification is not a panacea. It's a complex operation. You have to do it well, and more to the point, you can't delegate the responsibilities totally to third parties. The other thing that I want to highlight, and that's something that Mr. Rollo said, the security of supply implications, which I'm quite astounded not to hear any of the other participants mention anything about, especially in the current context. We are, let us not forget, dependent. 70% of our current consumption of energy is fossil energy, and we're dependent on imports for 70% of it. And for oil and gas, it's upwards of 90%. Are we in a position? Yes, you've highlighted it. We're the biggest consumer of oil and gas in the world, perhaps. But are we really in a position to be extremely prescriptive in terms of how exactly methane emissions should be monitored? Are we in a position to go to the US and Russia right now and tell them, we've just signed up the Global Methane Pledge, where we've all agreed on our common contribution towards meeting it. We've all signed up to it, but we don't really believe that you'll deliver. So we've come up with a regulation that is telling you that, in fact, we're going to regulate you anyway. How would we look? I think we should consider all these difficulties and come up with something at the end of the day that makes sense. And I haven't heard so far a proposal with regards to how we could regulate imports of oil, gas, and coal. That makes a great deal of sense. I think diplomacy is extremely important. Shining a light on those emission sources that we are seeing everywhere with our own technology, so no one will be able to prevent us from using it, is an excellent first step. To make it extremely difficult in the end, in a few years, for anyone to hide behind them with methane emissions, we'll be able to point at them and say, look, we know all about your methane emission problem, which you're not tackling. And you have to do more than just to sign up to international agreements. You have to show us that you're making efforts. I think that's a fairly strong approach that we can be taking. And so I'm inclined to not agree on the ambition with regards to imports. And I'm focusing on that because I suspect that once you ask on LDAR and on venting and flaring, the same sort of comments will come. We should have done more on imports. So perhaps we've covered those points already as far as I'm concerned, certainly.
Thanks, Malcolm McDowell, and thanks for raising the point about the current context in which we are with the current surge in prices on the gas market. So maybe let me turn to Martin Hosig now with a question related to this. I mean, given the current situation on gas markets globally, is it a good idea to start imposing regulations inside Europe on methane, but also potentially, like you were suggesting, on exporters of natural gas at a time when we're in such a fragile situation here in Europe? Martin Hosig, what's your view on that?
Well, for me, it's perfect time, because the windfall profits that the companies have are clearly not just enabling them to do things, but also are ultimately showcasing there is way more money leaking out of the pipes. It's way more money going up in the air. So it's not only about the climate impact on the methane emissions, it's about the bottom line impact of the methane emissions. If the suppliers would be able to sell us or other clients a couple more million of cubic meters of methane, they would make more money. So for me, yes, when the price is high, then you ultimately want to look at how to make sure that you use every bit of the product. So this is purely financial question, which I think, yes, it's to our advantage. And second, I don't agree on the kind of concern that there are no feasible solutions and how we can now, in the fragile state, when we're looking where we can get the fossil gas, be asking someone to not put while they're doing it. Well, First of all, it shows me, and that's beyond the scope of the methane regulation, it shows me how hypocritical it is to talk about fossil gas as the key transition solution. No, it's the kind of likely the last fossil fuel that we're going to switch off, but it's something that should be the last resort when we don't have energy efficiency and renewables providing sufficient solution today. Hence, bit of a side issue, the taxonomy link. Now, second, what I think it's important here to look at is, okay, can we, instead of imposing things on the importers or kind of trying to make sure that the Putin's regime is following European legislation, that's not going to happen, say we create a level playing field. We create a level playing field where we, by using the independent estimates of our own satellites, which we accept are not, detailed as on site, but still provide us with quite some picture, put a carbon border adjustment on methane in the imported fossil fuels, and use this revenue to lessen our dependency on future fossil fuels. Very simple solution. Less imports, more energy independence for Europe, and actually a market mechanism that creates a level playing field for European operators. What is stopping us from that?
Okay, thanks, Martin Hojsík, for this interesting suggestion. Let me turn to Jutta Paulus now, maybe for a reaction about the current situation on the gas markets globally. And clearly, Europe is in a very difficult position right now. Is it the right moment to impose tougher rules on methane, both in Europe and potentially beyond? Or do you believe, like Martin Hojsík, that on the contrary, it's the perfect time?
Well, actually, I really liked, Martin, I really liked your statement saying this is hypocritical, because if we would always say, well, but we depend on this country or that country regarding this or that commodity, so we just throw overboard all our values, all our legislation, all that we are actually standing for as European Union, then we could as well give back our Nobel Peace Prize and all the stuff we have received, and forget about human rights declaration, and how about Uyghurs being forced to slave labor? Never mind about that. So I think this is the again a decisive issue. You cannot go forward saying as long as we as our opponents, so to speak, or as a different political system, let's call it that, has something in its hands, we must not stand up and impose anything on them which they might find inconvenient, because we must not anger them. That's a sort of, I would not go so far to call it appeasement policy, but it goes in this direction. How can we honestly say we're battling climate change, we're doing our utmost to reach our climate targets, when at the same time we are saying we're turning a blind eye to what Europe is causing in other parts of the world? Yes, of course, there is a possibility that, for example, Gazprom, but also other actors on the global stage will say, well, this is a perfect excuse for us for not delivering to Europe anymore. But to be very honest, if they want to, they will find an excuse in everything which we do or do not do. I mean, you have heard the very curious reactions from some politicians in and outside Russia concerning the current situation in the Donbass and at the border. So they don't need any pretext on us tackling methane emissions for putting pressure on the European Union. And if we are caving in now, if we are making ourselves smaller than we are, then of course we will send this signal to the world. Well, look at the ambitious climate leader who walked in the Paris negotiation room arm in arm with the Ambition Coalition. Look what they're doing when we put a little pressure on them. If we want to remain trustworthy, if we want to really stick to our climate targets, then we cannot say, oh, there's a difficulty, we should leave this now. We have, I believe, sufficient possibilities which could be deployed pretty quickly, at least when it comes to energy efficiency. I have seen so many examples where energy is just wasted, that we should not try to please our trade partners by backing from our environmental targets. Thanks.
Thanks. Let me put the question now to Didier Olo from Eurogas. So with a view to the current situation on gas markets globally, I mean, obviously there is a huge concern specifically in Europe. Does that change, in your view, the way the European Union should approach regulation on methane emissions?
Well, let me consider several things. First, I think it's difficult that we criticize the US for extraterritorial legislation and that now we are just considering doing exactly the same. So deciding what legislation should apply to other countries is always quite a tough issue. So I suggest to be prudent. Second, there is a relatively easy way to both decrease our dependency on imports and reduce methane emission, which is developing biogas far more rapidly than we currently do. You know, the assessment of the biogas potential by European Biogas Association is huge. So it will not bring us to self-sufficiency, but it will significantly reduce the imports. And therefore, it will give us some leverage on the different importers, because then we may have more choice and more leverage to say, well, we cannot get rid of all our imports, but we certainly can choose to protect more this one than that one, when at the same time we increase our own production. And by increasing our own production, we reduce the methane emission from agriculture. And that's a very, very significant contribution to the global reduction of methane emission. So I think that's something which we should certainly take more into account in our fight against methane emission. And I take this opportunity to say that to the ones who pretend that methanization, so production of biomethane, is emitting a lot of methane, that it's simply not true. We have measured emission extensively on some of the recent biogas production plants that we have in France, and we have found a level of leaks which were below the measurement capacity. So a well-operated biomethane plant is not emitting any methane, but it's reducing a lot of spontaneous emission from manure, from different products that we put into the methanization. So that's a very efficient way to reduce methane emission, but also to improve our security of supply and give us some leverage in the negotiation with upstream players. Now, should we do more? Yes, and I agree with Martin that at the current price, it should be worth for the exporting countries to fight against leaks, because they can get more value out of the gas they will be able to sell than it will cost them to reduce venting. I take a very simple example. In Europe, for the past 5 to 10 years, depending on operators, when we have to empty a high-pressure pipe to do a repair, we are sucking the gas out of this piece of pipe, compressing it into the nearest pipe, so as to avoid venting or flaring this gas from the piece of pipe that we need to repair. In Russia, they are still venting it, not even flaring it, but venting it, which is very detrimental. And we are sure that at the current price, it's worth bringing a mobile compressor and saving this gas and avoiding to vent it. So we may help them, convince them that it's their own well understood interest to adopt such good practices. And I agree that the current prices make it worse for them to do it. So it's the right time to do this kind of movement. Can it be done through legislation or through more soft power? I think today soft power is probably more efficient for this kind of good practices. But once again, at the end of the day, the issue is, I heard about imposing our legislation on foreign countries, but if they don't do anything and just wait to see if we will shut down the valve, will we shut it down in the middle of winter? No, we don't. So not enforceable obligations are not good for our credibility.
Thanks, Didier. Let me turn to Dagmar Drogsma now about the current situation on gas markets. Do you believe this is a reason to change or adapt the EU's approach to methane regulation? Do you think this is something that risks pushing up prices even further? Or do you agree with some of the other speakers that it can also contribute to actually lowering prices while also lowering emissions?
Thank you, Frederick, for that question. And I think ultimately we've got to keep in mind why we want this legislation. And it's not a coincidence that I started my statement with referring to what the IPCC got across very clearly last year, namely that if you cut methane emissions urgently, 1.5 degrees is still within your reach. So that is basically the price that we can get by enforcing this legislation. So, I fully accept the issues that at the moment are playing in terms of gas prices and what have you. And I also really understand the impact that has on lots of people in society in Europe. But it's short term over longer term. And I think, therefore, that's already a very conclusive reason that you can't simply then forget about cutting methane emissions and just let the future disappear into oblivion. I think perhaps as a last remark, and perhaps to remind people of something that Frans Timmermans said himself, this whole current price hike in the European energy sector, it shows very clearly the need to reduce the EU's dependency on imported fossil fuels and speed up our transition of green energy. It sums it up, doesn't it? So there's several things we need to do. That's one of it. The other one is reducing methane emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I understand Georgopoulos needs to leave soon. Maybe a final remark?
Actually, I would have already left, to be very honest. I just didn't want to be so impolite. So I would like to thank everyone for the interesting discussion and happy to discuss these issues further, as of course we will work on this legislation in the European Parliament in the coming weeks and months. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Can I maybe just put a question while you're still there, and because Martin Hosig might also want to chip in. There is still an open question in European Parliament as to who will be the rapporteur for the methane regulation. Can you tell us very briefly where we are at now with these discussions? Have the political groups come to an agreement on that?
The leadership will be in the ENVI committee because it's an environmental issue, and ITRO will deliver an opinion, the Industry Research Energy Committee. And yesterday, ENVI coordinators had the bidding process, so we will have a rapporteur from ID on this file.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgopoulos, for
we have no name
today.
yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Martin Hosig, maybe a quick word about this question of who's going to get the leadership on this file in the European Parliament. So it's going to be with the ID group. Can you tell us maybe how you see those negotiations now shaping up within the Assembly?
Well, I have to say I'm a bit concerned about the fact that it's got ID, but they indeed gave most of the points in the bidding process for the file. We'll have to see how the negotiations will look like, because for number of groups, including my one, there is a cordon sanitaire for ID because of the undemocratic policies and statements. So this is something that will have to be seen, but definitely to start with, there will be work on the amendments and discussions within the individual political groups. I guess those of us who have been following the topic will be also informally talking across the groups. I expect that we might have an informal changes between the shadows of who've been following meetings since the own initiative report. So let's see. I'm expecting to hear who will be having the file from the ID group and what will be the approximate timeline as the closest next steps, because it's going to be important. But also I'm looking forward to more discussions with different stakeholders. Definitely, for example, hearing about biogas, if we keep sufficient, not only the methane leaks covered, but also accidents, then I have to say I see quite a bit of a potential there within, for example, the utilization of the organic waste, also, for example, from municipalities as a potential source of a biomethane. There are definitely lots of interesting discussions. Also, hoping for more in-depth discussions with the Commission, because my preference is to not just hear the different stakeholders out, but also to kind of have a critical exchange with the Commission on how they see different parts of the proposal before coming up with my own amendments. But they will come.
Thanks, Martin Hosek. And now there's a question from the audience, which is currently top in the here on our platform. So for you, Malcolm McDowell, it's a question about biogas. So why is biogas production not part of the scope of the regulation, even though the Commission identified leaks from biogas plants as one of the main identified sources of methane in the methane strategy? Can you very briefly explain that?
Sure, I can answer that question quickly, and I want to also come back on a few other points I haven't had a chance to come back on, if I may. Biogas production, and first I want to say vis-a-vis the potential for biogas, we completely concur with industry that this is an opportunity definitely to ramp up renewables. And in this particular context, the switch, to accelerate the switch towards renewable sources of gas is not just biogas, it's sustainable renewable sources of gas. Let's not forget they should be sustainable. Not all biogas necessarily is. Though I would ask a question about how quickly we can ramp up biogas production. The last figures that I had looked at, we were talking about less than 10% of natural gas production of consumption. Less than 10% of overall gas consumption is biogas consumption. Yes, is biogas consumption. So it will not quickly replace natural gas. Why didn't we did cover biogas, biomethane in this proposal? From the point of injection onwards, it's covered. If the leak from a pipeline is a methane leak, irrespective of its origin, of course, it has to be controlled and repaired. So it's covered from the point of injection. From the point of production to the point of injection, the Renewable Energy Directive already covers that, and already has incentives to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, and specifically the methane emissions in biogas production. But we're actually reinforcing that, and the JRC is currently doing some work for us to use the delegated powers available to the Commission to provide stronger incentives, such as also a methane calculation methodology to deliver actual values with regards to methane emissions in biogas plants, and this will reinforce the incentives already in the RED, but the RED covers the production aspect of biogas. And I want to come back on some of the other points. We're talking about increasing prices further and whether or not this proposal could have an impact on prices, and considering in the current context. Let me be clear, when I spoke about the current context, I was talking about the security of supply aspect situation. I'm not talking about the possible impact it could have on prices. I think we go at length in the impact assessment to highlight how cost effective a lot of the measures are. And the higher the price of natural gas, fossil gas, the more cost effective these measures are. If you look at the numbers in the impact assessment, even if you take into account the very high costs of methane emissions to society, off the top of my head, between 3,000 and 4,000 euros per ton of methane as calculated by UNEP and the CCAC, you find that still a large majority of the measures pay for themselves and are less costly than the cost to society of methane. So the cost effectiveness aspect is covered, and it will not have an impact on prices we consider. Otherwise, there was a point that was made, and I forget who made that point, that we don't have any obligations for coal mines to mitigate their methane emissions. We have very extensive obligations for all parts of coal mines, including abandoned and closed coal mines, to mitigate their methane emissions. That's quite wrong. I want to come back on what was said also by both MEPs, talking about how we're being hypocrites by not regulating imports. I think it's not quite, I think, as simple as that. We believe in international agreements. We believe in the sovereignty of the other parties signing up to international agreements. That's why we still have them. If we were as cynical as has been described, I think we wouldn't be signing up anymore international agreements. I expect both MEPs believe in the Paris Agreement. The whole essence of the Paris Agreement is for everyone to take on their own responsibilities and demonstrate efforts towards reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. If we were to consider ourselves to be hypocritical by not regulating those other companies, and therefore try to regulate them, it would mean not only that we wouldn't respect the sovereignty of those countries, but we wouldn't believe in international agreements. And I don't think anyone here definitely would defend that. With regards to CBAM, the scope is there for including methane emissions at a later date, but CBAM was very much developed specifically for dealing with CO2 emissions for the ETS, in fact, on which we have extremely good data, point source data, and which isn't the situation for methane right now. I think we can consider a CBAM later on when the fruits of this regulation come through in a few years' time, and we have a rather good baseline in terms of methane emissions, and we're able to know exactly the magnitude, occurrence, location of those methane emissions, which we don't today, even in the EU, unlike CO2 emissions. And then we'll be able to, and not just in the EU, but in other parts of the world, of course. And then I think we maybe could consider at a later date extending the CBAM to methane. And I think I've covered all points. Yes, thanks.
Thanks, Malcolm. We've reached the end of this conference, but before we close, I would like to ask each one of you to summarize very briefly in 2 sentences what you would like our audience to take home with them. And so let me start with you, Malcolm.
Well, as I've said at the beginning, I think we have an ambitious proposal, and don't take for granted any aspects of that proposal in terms of the level of ambition that we struck. And don't forget, if you consider the import part is not ambitious enough, that we also have the means after a few years, very, very close in time in the future, to review and increase the ambition if required, but with the right approach and the right assessment, and taking into account also the fact that we still believe in international agreements and still believe that we can actually achieve a lot in terms of methane emission reductions with our partner countries in the next few years via via the international agreements that we have signed up, notably the Global Methane Pledge.
Thanks. Martin Hosek, your own main message very quickly.
Well, it is a step in the right direction, but there is bigger step that we can take. The opportunity shall not be missed. And I think this is indeed an opportunity. And we need to create a level playing field for the European businesses with their foreign competition while ensuring high protection of our climate, because there is only one planet that we have.
Thank you. Didier Hulot, your main message from today's conference in 2 sentences, please.
First, the European gas industry has already done a lot in reduction of methane leaks. We are still working on it. We can still improve. We work under the assumption that all leaks are preventable and should be prevented, and we will continue doing that. We welcome the Methane Pledge because it will allow a lot of countries to have the same level of good practices as the European gas industry has, and that will improve the global situation. And third, we strongly believe that the gas industry is part of the solution by collecting biogas on one side, collecting gas from old coal mines, for instance, on the other side, and thus contributing to the reduction of methane emission today. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Didier Hulot. And to close now, Dagmar Drogsma, your takeaway from today's conference, very quickly, please.
Very quickly. So we do think there are many positive elements in the draft legislation, particularly of the technical measures, MRV, LDAR, and venting and flaring. We are underwhelmed by the parts on imports, but also, we'd love to work with the Commission, with the Parliament and Council and business as well, actually, because you cannot really help us improve that part of the legislation and try and find solutions that are credible and really help us to reduce the emissions that need to be reduced.
Many thanks, Dagmar Drogsma. I think this wraps up today's event. A big thanks to EDF Europe for supporting it. A big thanks as well to our panelists for your time, for joining in today, as well as to our viewers for tuning in and following us. If you missed the beginning of this debate, you can still watch it on YouTube and other social media platforms. And if you'd like to know more about upcoming events on Euractiv, you can check that on our website, events.euractiv.com. That's it for me. We hope to see you again soon. In the meantime, take care and bye-bye.